Welcome everyone to our webinar today on advancing equity in emerging industries. My name is Jason and my role during the webinar will be to help you out with the technology. If you have any technical troubles with what you're seeing or what you're hearing, both of those during the webinar today, just send me a chat message. Look for the little chat bubble down there in the bottom of your toolbar. Send those chat messages over to me and I'll work behind the scenes and take care of the tech issues for you as best as I can. Our session is being recorded today. We'll have the playback available on all our social media sites, so be on the lookout for that so that you can share that with your friends. We also will allow you to ask questions of our panelists today. You can do that by using the Q&A button. Again, down there, look at your toolbar, the little Q&A button. When you click on that, type in your question. We'll keep track of all those questions, and then we'll tackle those during our Q&A time today. So we look forward to seeing your questions. Again, if you have any problems with the technology, simply send me a chat message. More than happy to help you out with that. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, again, welcome. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Akile.
Thanks, Jason. Welcome, everyone. Really excited for today's panel. My name is Akile Parnell. I'm an attorney with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is a civil rights organization made up of advocates and attorneys working to advance racial equity and economic opportunity for all. Today's panel is about advancing equity in emerging industries, which is a core part of the work that we do, in particular to advance equitable community development and housing justice here in Chicago. Alma Campos will be the moderator for today. We have a great group of panelists. And so with that, welcome, and I'll turn it over to Alma to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So I'm very excited. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Alma Campos. I'm a bilingual journalist and editor. I am the immigration editor at Southside Weekly. I also write about the workings behind systems of power, focusing on immigrant and working class communities as it relates to economic development and business, and as well as labor. I just want to, introduce this great panel. We have a great panel with us made up of diverse local voices in cannabis, tech, government, and green economy industry. Joining us is Stacey Berdejo, who serves as senior caseworker and outreach coordinator for U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth. Stacey's issues area include immigration, criminal justice, civil rights, foreign affairs, election law, Latinx outreach, and among others. We also have Jeff Gamble, PhD, who is the founder and CTO of Rezilient Health. Rezilient Health is a Techstars-backed company that has raised over $2 million to build a virtual-first healthcare platform where patients have access to both traditional video telehealth and a network of neighborhood hubs where they can get virtual access to their doctor, as well as physical exams, labs, and imaging. We are also joined by Manny Mendoza, who is the Southside native and the founder and chef of culinary cannabis pop-up called Herbal Notes, founded in 2017. Manny is a career-long chef and hospitality professional, formerly beginning his career at the Culinary Institute of America in New York, training amongst some of the best chefs in the world. Joining us today is also Reverend Tony Pierce, who is a co-pastor of Heaven's View Christian Fellowship Church in Peoria, Illinois, and also the board president of Illinois People's Action. Reverend Pierce created and he administers the Heaven's View Community Development Corporation, where he trains disadvantaged workers into a renewable jobs pipeline in the solar energy sector. And we also have Anton Seals Jr., who is a South Shore native and executive director of Grow Greater Englewood, and also who is a social enterprise focusing on building an equitable and resilient local food system that fosters protections of vacant land in divested communities and connects residents with community wealth building opportunities. So let's get started. I want to ask, and feel free to jump in, how and why did you get involved in the industry that you work in?
Is that an open question for anybody to step in?
Yeah, anyone, go ahead.
So I was gonna, good afternoon, everybody. So I got in this industry in the urban ag and environmental space through policy. I used to work for a member of Congress for several years, Congressman Bobby Rush. So I had the pleasure of serving the constituents of the 1st Congressional District for many years. So it was a great learning experience. And we did a lot of work around codifying food deserts back in 06 and 07 in that particular farm bill. And that kind of led and put its hooks in me in terms of how I got involved in the urban ag and food space. And has since been, advocating and helping build out even more Black and brown farmers and networks across the city to really look at how do we connect and foster this particular sector for, much more kind of advancement around economics, but also thinking about it, not just in terms of the monetary, but also from a health perspective as well, which then led me into other industries that are all kind of plant touching, including cannabis, outside of, my own enjoyment of the plant for many years. It's also now become much more, mainstream. So, we have farmers and growers who have also been working in those spaces as well. So that's kind of what Grow Greater Englewood kind of spawned from, was from that.
And I'll go next, I guess. As the board president of Illinois People's Action, I and that community organizing group are members of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition that represents about 200 organizations that are involved in the negotiations that will hopefully lead to the General Assembly's passage of the new green energy regulations for Illinois this year, and have Governor Pritzker sign it. And also I was involved in that process that resulted in the Future Energy Jobs Act being signed back in 2016 to regulate green energy in Illinois. So that's how I got involved in this space.
I can jump in next. So I'm in the tech space, the health tech space in particular. So for me, I came in through the engineering angle. Was an engineer by training. During grad school, knew that I wasn't too interested in kind of continuing on as an academic. I got lucky in that one of my professors had an investor-backed company that they were looking for someone to work part-time. I knew absolutely nothing about kind of the tech startup space at the time, but I kind of took a stab at it, ended up doing that for a couple of years, and that just kind of snowballed into me getting deeper and deeper into this industry. So it really took someone kind of advocating on my behalf before I really got that introduction into the space.
Do you want to go,
Hey,
Manny?
everybody. Sure, I'll go. I got into my space through the culinary, hospitality, section, and I've just been lifelong involved with that. It's been a passion, but more than that, just going to culinary school and traveling the country and serving so many people, it really opened my eyes to how powerful food is as a universal language that can really transcend and connect people in really incredible ways. And I've seen it firsthand, and we all know that we can speak to different people through food, by sharing our food cultures, and I wanted to bridge the cannabis culture and subcultures in with hospitality and food to kind of create a little ecosystem where people can enjoy cannabis and can enjoy food. And I turned this platform into basically a culinary cannabis supper club. Where we would basically invite and collaborate with other entrepreneurs, especially Black and brown entrepreneurs in the cannabis space, into our events, and then foster a little ecosystem that promotes health and wellness and education and social responsibility about being educated and conscious consumers in an emerging cannabis industry.
Hi, and I became interested in government mostly because I understood the importance of safety nets and government programs. Growing up with an immigrant single mother that worked in a factory, we were on food stamps and Section 8 and reduced lunch. And I pretty early on realized the importance and how powerful these programs were. And they allowed me to focus on school instead of my basic needs, which was incredibly pivotal at that time. And then afterwards, I was interested in law and in government. So I decided to go to law school. I was a public defender for a few years. And it was just completely disheartening to see when the problem is structural, there's just so little that you can do within the system. And I really became interested in trying to understand, the greater structure, the policies and the laws that ultimately resulted in all of these Black and brown men being incarcerated. So I did a fellowship, an unpaid fellowship on the Hill. And that's where I got introduced to government work, and I was able to do a fellowship on the Hill. And I worked for Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky on the House side, and then I worked for Senator Tammy Duckworth on the Senate side. But that's really what opened up my eyes to government and what gave me the opportunity to even be in that space.
Thank you all for that. And before I jump into the next question, I wanted to encourage our audience to use the chat box for questions. Just throw them in throughout the discussion, and we're going to have a Q&A the last 15 minutes of the conversation, so we'll address some of those. So my next question, for everyone, what are some of the biggest barriers that exist for BIPOC people, specifically those in disinvested communities trying to enter into these emerging industries? Anyone can jump in.
After you.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and go. Within the solar industry, there are significant barriers that BIPOC companies have to be able to clear to get into the industry. In fact, the barriers are so significant that right now, only about 2% of the companies in the solar industry are BIPOC companies. So I'll comment right now on the two most significant barriers, and then we can maybe talk about more later on. But first of all, to be a company in the BIPOC arena in solar requires significant technical expertise. As an entrepreneur, you have to, have the technical expertise in regards to knowing the various solar products that are available in the industry and how they work. And then in addition to the technical barriers, you have to have significant access to capital, so that that capital will be required for you to obviously get contracts with your customers, to be able to procure the various systems that your company would install at customer sites, to have those systems delivered there, and then to employ the personnel necessary to install and manage those systems. And solar is a clean energy form that is replacing, among other green energies, the coal-based energy that has powered our nation for over a century. So that's a learning curve that you have to go up. And I am co-owner of a couple different solar companies. One's a marketing company, CTP Power, that you can find out more about at ctp.com. And then our solar installation company, Sunbright Energy. You can find out more about that at sunbright-energy.com. So anyway, those are kind of the barriers that you're faced with in the solar industry.
I would say in the tech industry more generally, I'll piggyback off that and say capital is definitely a huge one. Especially as you get into the earlier stages, your success is dependent on your ability to raise money from private investors who are overwhelmingly white men, essentially. And there's a lot of data around who is getting funded, who is not. Most of the recent diversity efforts that we've seen in early stage tech, especially on who's getting VC funding, I would say white women are the biggest beneficiary of those diversity efforts thus far. Over the last year, you've started to see that kind of expand a bit more broadly, especially as companies got a lot more public pressure kind of starting from last summer, moving on to start pouring money into Black and brown enterprises. But you know, I'm optimistic, but you know, in the short term, it really hasn't. You really haven't seen the gains. And then as you move later stage into the tech industry, it really comes down to who's making the hiring decisions. I think there's this notion that, you know, you have to be like a software engineer in order to get into the tech industry, and that's not true at all. There's sales teams, marketing teams, operation teams, PR teams, et cetera. So there are many different angles to get into the industry, but in the end, a lot of the hiring decisions are being made by people who tend to hire either from their personal networks, or they tend to hire people who look like themselves. And so in the end, Black and brown people or other underserved communities, they just kind of inherently get left out. And so there is kind of this structural issue that persists that it's really hard to kind of get down to the bottom of.
Yeah, totally. Manny, do you want to?
Yeah. The biggest barrier that, some of there's many. I mean, a common denominator obviously is access to capital, especially in cannabis space for any Black and brown entrepreneurs that want to get licenses. So, access to capital is the first one, but obviously more broadly, loans, grants, and funding education is another big one. That's a huge barrier because it inhibits people from being able to think more broadly that they can pursue a career in those fields, or that they can get into, a high paying cannabis position by going to school for any STEM courses. So that's a big one. But the biggest one, in my opinion, when it comes to the cannabis space as an emerging industry, it's the main fact that there are no exemptions for people with nonviolent drug felonies, meaning people can't transition into a legal market and build generational wealth. So that's one of the biggest things, because it's just going to continue to be a cat and mouse game for this industry to keep evolving and growing the way it is, where it's predominantly white male dominated and owned, controlling the majority of market share and equity and real estate and access to capital, all these things that are concentrated in one area. Meanwhile, there's an illicit market that is, quote unquote thriving, but that's not really the ideal scenario that we want when we're thinking of how do we heal and regenerate our neighborhoods and our communities. How do we bring people out of these marginalized fringes of society and bring them into a legal market? Well, we have to, acknowledge that some of them come with history. Some of them come with prior things that, shouldn't exempt them from being able to transition and to build a new future, and to start to, reinvest that into their communities and make, their own communities, make our own communities better, by having that kind of access. So that's a really big one, that I've just started to notice just through all my talks with people all throughout the cannabis industry, from the legal side down to my dealers who are family people. They're family people and they're taking care of their families, and I ask them, why can't they get a license, or why don't they consider one? Well, there's no way for them. There's no way for them to transition without feeling like they're going to be put right back under the system, and right into the system and be recycled through it. So that's one of the biggest barriers that I see that exists for BIPOC people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, no, go ahead, Stacey.
No, I was just going to share. I know that I don't work in an emerging industry, but the inequities and lack of diversity in government really affects all of the other industries, especially like the makeup of the staff. So this last Congress was one of the most diverse Congresses in the history, but the staff was not. We're still incredibly a very just white staff, especially at the top levels. So there are only 2 Black chief of staffs for the entire Senate. And there are only 2 Black communications directors for the Senate. So out of 50 members, only 2 of them really have that view, that perspective. And that really makes a difference because it affects the makeup of the staff, affects the shape and the direction of the legislation that's going to come out of that Congress. And some of the biggest barriers to become a staffer is that all of the internships, the majority of the internships, except for some offices, are not paid. So that means that in order for you to be an intern or a fellow on the Hill, you need to have multiple jobs, or you need to have family that gives you money. So the only people that could afford to intern or to be a fellow on the Hill are people that come from money, that have these connections, that have this network, that have this capital. So it's kind of like an ongoing story. And then when you try to get hired, it's an absolute requirement that you have internship or fellowship experience. So how do you do that? So it really, we really have a problem as far as the staff of Congress and the lack of diversity. And just going along with how that affects everything, it's the same thing: networks, capital, geography, the turnover. As people become, as you're climbing the ladder, it's the same thing. People start hiring people that look like them. So at the senior levels, you have older white men that are making all the laws, and they're hiring and they're giving promotions to other people that look like them. So unless we are intentional and purposeful about making a difference and creating legislation and creating practices that go against this, then these types of structural problems are going to be in every industry.
Just to add something to what Stacey said, we see similar things in the tech industry where even if you are able to, say, raise a seed round, so you've got a couple $1 million coming in for your company, your salary as a founder or early employee is still well below market rate. And you're expected to be well below market rate for a couple years. And so you're taking on some level of financial risk as well while you're waiting to see whether or not this thing blows up or not. And for BIPOC people who statistically are carrying higher levels of college debt, higher levels of grad school debt, for many of us, you can't take that risk, right? And so you start to see this bifurcation too at the early stages where I may be able to raise money, I may have a great idea, I may have the right strategy, but because of my current living financial situation, I can't take that financial risk for this long-term upside. And so when you start talking about policy, getting rid of college debt actually has huge downstream impact on the risks that people are willing to take at, early in their careers and middle career.
Yeah, I can't add really much to, all the points are, the same in all of the different spaces. It's institutional, when they talk about what institutional racism is or the denial of it. So you still have half of the country that's in denial that it doesn't even exist. So that's part of the issue, is that there is denial that these things everyone is starting at the same place and everyone's working really hard. And I think that there's, because you're living in a diverse society and the narrative is being changed from a kind of a white dominated narrative around what the American identity is. So it's a legacy of what, America as an enterprise was created to do. So I think being really clear about that is the enterprise that America was created to do. So I think it has a historical framework that, 400 years later, is that Black farmers are fighting for retribution from when land was just stolen and the government. So this probably isn't this framework to talk about in terms of the historical components, but, I could definitely, in other spaces, we talk about the history, because it has to be really clear about the history. And I think part of what happened this past weekend around Juneteenth and the symbolism of these pieces in terms of it being more than just a symbol and doing the work beyond the symbolism. So in one case you have we're going to nationalize Juneteenth, but on the other end we have people attacking voting rights. These kind of, to delegitimize whole swaths of community and the efforts, it's just, it's something I think that is still part of the American fabric. So it seeps into why Black and brown folks don't have access to capital. In particular for Black folks who have a legacy of being denied capital. And then in the nonprofit sector, it's usually around the lack of capacity. And so we often use this word or framework around risk, and risk means that what I feel most comfortable in doing. And so that's also part and based on what the expectations are, whether they're voiced or not. I think that's a big part of what many folks are still dealing with in terms of emerging. And then lastly, I would just say that the kind of sea change that we really need, unfortunately, government has not been willing to take that risk, and you have forces within government that don't see it being the safeguard to take that risk. So Manny talked about it eloquently around, the access to the cannabis industry. Well, this is not just about equity, this is about repair. Reparational economics means that the systems, both private and public, intentionally keep people out of an economic advantage. So what we're still struggling with is that we don't even agree that that is the case. And so what you end up with is often those on the other side giving anecdotes about this individual or that individual, as opposed to the system that has, it 50-1 across the space. So I think that we're still in that battle, to be really clear. And I think that that's part of where the American identity is really struggling around even these emerging industries.
Yeah, thank you for that context and for your insight and drawing those connections. So my next question is, you all touched on this a little bit. What are some of the biggest, what do you think, you touched on what some of those big barriers are that exist, right, for BIPOC people in these industries. So what do you think is needed to make these emerging industries more equitable? You all talked a little bit about it, but if you could expand, that would be great. So, yeah, what is needed to make these emerging industries more equitable? And do you all have any specific examples?
Sure, I can kick it off and we can go back the other way this time.
Yeah.
I think democratic economic tools, so cooperative structures, having more worker owner cooperatives is one way to be able to spread the wealth. Redefining and using the public dollar to create new public banking institutions are going to be really important. Lowering the I think abolishing the credit scoring system, which is fraught with racism, which is the kind of where we moved out of the analog world into the digital world, that also kind of that provides an opportunity to do a kind of really direct but cloaked racism around who gets access to capital, and not just access to capital, because you can get access to capital, it's just that they will charge you more for that capital. So I think that there's going to have to be new ways that cities and municipalities, because between capitalism and democracy is supposed to be the lion that protects us from the pit bull of capitalism. Unfortunately, it's been a little kitty cat and has not been able to use the government, the tools of the state in order to access for these kind of emerging industries easier ways. But I have seen an uptick in terms of philanthropic forces looking at new ways to provide that risk, using their different corpuses to help small businesses compete and think about new ways to spread the wealth. So I think there are some exciting things on that end that I'm seeing in the food system that are, and in cannabis potentially around, and those who want to disrupt or interrupt what we currently have, in place.
Well, I'll give several examples that are of things that are being done in the emerging solar industry to give BIPOCs more opportunity. First of all, as I've already stated, the General Assembly is in the process of putting together the new legislation, which will regulate green energy for the next 5 years. So as part of the negotiations that are going on relative to that, our coalition has proposed that there be 13 incubators or green energy solar hubs throughout Illinois to provide training and technical assistance so that they can help develop interested BIPOC individuals into certified solar installers. Also so that they can develop interested potential BIPOC entrepreneurs into certified BIPOC contractors. And then as a level above that, our proposal includes that there be several regional green energy accelerators to develop interested BIPOC entrepreneurs into certified BIPOC general contractors across the state. And that's important because, as has been mentioned already, people tend to hire and promote people who look like them. And therefore, since the solar industry right now, only 2% of that industry consists of BIPOC employees and contractors and general contractors, it's important that we get a significant number of general contractors out in the field, because it will be the general contractors that will drive the employment of subcontractors or the development of subcontractors and the employment of more BIPOC employees. Hopefully, so that we get to the point that the labor force in solar mirrors the BIPOC population percentage in Illinois. That's about 40%. And so 2% is a long way from there, but these hubs and these accelerators will help get us there. And then the issue of financial capital has been spoken to. And so the proposal includes the formation of 2 financial nonprofit entities that will function like green banks to make no interest and low interest loans and grants available to BIPOC entrepreneurs for at least the first 5 years of their operation, so that access to capital doesn't continue to be, let me explain it that way, so it doesn't continue to be the tremendous hurdle or problem that it is right now. And then last of all, a couple points is that our proposal includes regional training programs within the Illinois Department of Corrections, so that individuals that are within the last 12 months of their sentence can begin their training to get into the BIPOC, to the solar industry when they're released, and so that they then can connect with the training hubs that I already spoke about, and that these training programs include not only alumni from the Department of Corrections, but also alumni from the foster care network, because we are well aware that when it comes to BIPOC communities, a significant portion of those communities are individuals who have a history of having been part of the incarceration system or been part of the foster care network.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to ask, what types of help and resources can Black and Brown entrepreneurs find to help them build businesses and careers in these industries?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what I've found, at least in the tech industry, there's been a huge proliferation of, local either accelerator or training programs where they'll take people from non-traditional backgrounds, help them get up to speed with skills in the tech industry. We have a lot of those here in St. Louis. I found that like local universities, both public and private, tend to have a lot of resources around the local entrepreneurial system. Some more than others. Some will have kind of more direct contact with companies, whereas others may have access to kind of educational programs that could then help you to go and try to get a job or try to get an internship in those programs. But universities, colleges, I think those are a really good one.
And I'll jump in here as well. One of the things that was mentioned was the burgeoning, or I guess the increasing amount of nonprofit entities that are bringing financing and other kinds of capital to help BIPOC individuals. That is occurring. I don't want to say that it's not, but it has a long way to go, because typically the financing that is presently being provided by these entities is very small in comparison to what is really needed. But it's good to see it there, and it is expected to grow. I would encourage individuals that have companies to, when they look at that, be aware of the difference between debt financing and equity financing, because some of these entities are, to give you capital, are going to want to receive a certain portion of the ownership of your business. And I'm not telling you whether to do that or not to do that, but I am suggesting that you want to thoroughly be aware of that and thoroughly analyze whether that's good for your business or not. And so the last thing that I'll mention there is something that is happening within the solar industry, is that because we're trying to see that great wages are being paid there, and labor is all about prevailing wages. On one hand, that's good. On the other hand, most startup businesses and emerging businesses can't afford to pay prevailing wages. And so because of that, one of the things that we're doing in the legislation is we're either trying to have that startup businesses and emerging BIPOC businesses will be exempt from that, or if they are not exempt from that, that the state subsidize that to the degree that money is brought to these new startup businesses and emerging businesses that will pay the gap between what they can afford and what the prevailing wage is. So those are some kinds of assistance that are being placed in the solar industry, or being looked at being placed in the solar industry, to make it more advantageous for BIPOCs to succeed there.
I wanted to, there was a really great follow-up question in our Q&A. I wanted to answer it right now, or see if, I think I saw Anton trying to answer the question on there. Maybe you can help us out with that. But it's a great follow-up question by Amalia Nieto Gomez. She says, what role can local hires play in diversifying industries? Examples requiring local hires, or disadvantaged or non-traditional workers as part of contracts, or increasing minority-owned and women-owned businesses. Anton?
Well, I was trying to type for that, not just that question, but another one as well, in terms of what funding sources. But I think the local hire is the minimum that can be done. I think this came up most recently because I'm in these two spaces around food system and cannabis, which caused a huge issue around cannabis companies then securing employees from disadvantaged impacted areas, or DIAs, that they can then qualify as a social equity applicant. So sometimes you have to be really cautious around even utilizing the local hires component, because, again, like we talked about earlier, some people who see this as another kind of what else do I need to do? It's to them very onerous. And that's usually because it's in a defensive kind of situation. So I think that, one of the things that, and there are other examples, is looking at companies that could also look at their vendor and procurement opportunities for Black and Brown owned businesses is going to be really important. That's another avenue. So when demanding, it's not just, you hiring someone, because there's been a lot of advocacy around, well, I want you to hire more for this or that. An example I can give is the work we did with Whole Foods at the genesis of Grow Greater Englewood around a community benefits agreement. And usually those agreements are, confrontational or acrimonious, But in this case, for the Englewood Whole Foods, it was not the case. In fact, the CEO, Walter Robb, actually thought our demands were on point and that he could go above them, right? Which would also include opportunities for vendors, small businesses to get into the whole food pipeline to expand their brands. Those are the kind of real wins when you talk about wealth building, as opposed to like an hourly job that fits very nicely on a, corporate social responsibility kind of, website, or, because they're always looking to tell their narrative that they are being good community partners. I think many of the corporations currently are, dealing with after what we have, just emerged from, which is the kind of pushback that we had publicly around, the champion of the sanctity of life, and and then also the pandemic. Those kind of perfect storms that we're just walking out of. So the level of accountability for corporations are going to continue to grow in terms of this changing narrative of, and even the language we're using. People are like, well, what's BIPOC mean? Black, indigenous, people of color, which also will probably go under another formation, because these large swaths don't articulate clearly enough in terms of, the different levels of what it really means to be an American. So that's where I think we also are trying to get back to. I mean, that's a much more larger concept, but that's what's underway. We are trying to renegotiate as Americans what it means to be an American, to be in this democracy, that I have access to these things. And on one end, we're saying we do not have the same access that others have. So I think that there are, ways in which the state can help demand in terms of their procurement process, because the states also and municipalities are also the first examples of like using their purse strings to help grow these kind of businesses. And they have just not done a really good job. Chicago is a majority Black and brown. This is a Black and Mexican city, period. Almost 70% of the population is Black and Mexican. In terms of who controls the purse strings, it's the smaller 30% of the white population that controls the majority of the wealth. That is the reality. However, they also they are also utilizing the tax dollars, which are 70% coming from the majority of the people, right? But you don't see that reflected in their procurement process. You just don't see these things in order. So there has to be a level of, when you start talking about equity, and really being clear about that, means that some people would have to stand back for others to be able to advance. And we just don't have that kind of real camaraderie in America on racial lines. People do not feel that. And in particular, white folks who don't articulate that publicly. And I think that there's a public pushback to these requests and demands that are only going to grow, even having these kind of conversations. Because I think that people live in a different world. And I think that's something that we have to address, as Stacey said, very intentionally, because if you're going to create policy, you have to call these things out. You have to address them, or we'll just continue to dust up, and then we don't have a democracy.
And that is what was just said is so important. I'll just tag this onto that. Every immigrant community now, we're unique because we didn't come here voluntarily, we were brought here. But every immigrant community that has come here, that has moved up the socioeconomic ladder, has done so because they had, in addition to a political agenda and an education agenda, they had an economic agenda that involved wealth building and ownership. Because good jobs that will give you good wages won't get you there alone, because inflation will take that away over time. You have to own something in America to move up the economic and socioeconomic ladder. And we have to get more of that, whether that's through the community agreements that was just referred to, or whether that's through procurement processes. I know there's risk involved, but if we don't move more aggressively into that arena, we will never move up off of being at the bottom. And in fact, Dr. King, when he was tragically killed, was moving to an economic agenda at Memphis. That's what he was there for. And so it's great that we have, as a African American, or it's BIPOC, let me say it that way, as BIPOC people, it's great that, and particularly for us at the very bottom, Black people, it's great that we have political agendas, it's great that we have educational agendas, but we've got to have economic agendas that get us there. Last comment here is that certainly if we're talking politics, for someone to win, someone has to lose, because there's just a certain amount of seats that are available. But the economic pie is a pie that grows for everyone if we work it the right way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Before we go into our Q&A, which I know we have a couple of questions there, I wanted to ask something, and I wanted to hear from Manny and Stacey. Hang on a second. I have a question. Yeah, what role do governments and government regulation play in making emerging industries more equitable?
I mean, I think they have a huge responsibility to not only regulate it, but be intentional and purposeful about some of these inequities. And like everyone on this panel has been saying, like, this is a structural problem, and unless we are intentional and purposeful about this, it's not going to change. And we need to put pressure and keep people accountable, from everyone from our local government to companies, to our federal government, because it matters and this makes a difference. And I think not losing sight of the fact that diversity helps everyone. It helps companies, it helps communities, it helps everyone. There was this report that on average, a company that is more diverse has about 19 points of revenue higher than a non-diverse company. So it just creates more money for you. It's beneficial for everyone. And I think really keeping people accountable to that fact, and forcing companies and elected officials to create purposeful, intentional solutions for that. So I know 2020 affected a lot of small businesses, but it really affected Black women. Black women were hurt the most, and minority businesses didn't have enough cash buffer to be able to really survive this. So a lot of the small businesses that ended up closing were minority businesses. So just being intentional and being purposeful, but I think from a community perspective, being the one that puts on that pressure to the companies, to your local elected officials, to your federal representatives and senators, because we need to be intentional and purposeful and fix it at every turn, or else it's not going to change.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of what Anton said, as far as policy and our democratic system having to be the lion that safeguards the people against capitalism and the exploitation of all these people, that's really what their role they have to kind of find it up inside themselves to really try to be that champion, because they are the safeguards to it. Otherwise, we're going to have a situation like another situation where like the pandemic happens, and then a few select people are able to capitalize, and not just capitalize, but completely take over, dominate, and monopolize an entire new industry. This new cannabis industry literally just started in Illinois, and right off the bat, the pandemic was actually beneficial to them, to these companies, while all of us Black and brown people were getting crushed and having our family members getting taken out, getting crushed economically, and also within our own family structures, having to deal with the burden of the pandemic. These companies made off like bandits. So there had to have been those safeguards in place, not just at 2020. In my opinion, it should have been from the onset, and back in 2014 when the medical program was even brought up for cannabis. It should have been rooted in social justice. It should have been rooted in trying to repair all of these different things that intersect and are a culmination of the reasons why we see what we see all around the South Side and the West Side, all over Chicago at this point. Really, it's really everywhere. And all of that frustration comes from, the lack of support from the government being able to safeguard us from these predatory, profit-seeking corporations that are just completely dominating, taking everything over. So, it's really big on government and elected officials to really try to step up to, corporations and reshift a lot of these economic resources back into these communities and really treat our situation like a pandemic, because it really is. There was a pandemic before COVID-19. It's a gun violence pandemic. It's a food desert pandemic. There's so many things that are already destroying our generations of families, that the last thing we need is this new industry that was already, historically being used to harm us and to incarcerate us on the highest global scale. But now to not even be able to reap the economic benefits from that and transition and start a new, shift our generation so that the next ones can start to build up instead of having to dig out of a hole. So yeah, government policies has a huge role in trying to step up to the plate and be fearless against corporations.
Yeah,
Thanks, Manny.
Manny.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna say, like, he, brought up a really important part for us not to lose sight in terms of like the struggles. Even if we're having this conversation around equity in these emerging industries, and some of these industries are, legacy industries as well. So even the prohibition of cannabis was a moneymaker because it was able to be racialized. So I think, having the history, the context is so important, because if we start thinking and giving the wrong kind of prognosis around what we're really dealing with, then we'll have it all skewed away. And I think we have to be just brutally honest that, foundationally, we still have, folks who are in our society that believe because they lack melanin in their skin, that some kind of way they are more advanced than others who do have melanin. I mean, that is just that is a undercurrent that is part of the structure of how people see America. But there's also an emerging of people who don't. I think many, in particular white folks and many others, say, oh, I don't even see race in that way. You hear that often. But these kind of things, like, I'm not using race to make my decision. I'm using, data, or I'm using, that it's all equitable, but that is not accurate. Couldn't possibly be accurate. So again, I think for all of us who are the Gen Xers and millennials and, the Gen Zers who are coming, part of it is interrupting this status quo that exists. And I think that will happen in our lifetime. But I think that there are two divergent kind of conversations around, capitalism, which seeks to extract in its nature, right? Which is like that I could just make one millionaire an even bigger millionaire. And that's how we define success, as opposed to that there is enough for everyone, which is, the laws of nature, that there is enough of water for everyone. There is enough of sunlight for everyone. So I think that those things are still going to be, fought out in terms of the concepts themselves. So I think that we have to be really mindful of that as we start thinking about, like, well, how do we just access capital for this industry or this industry? It's the entire gamut of, how we as Americans are approaching it. And then lastly, just the diversity is our, that just means that we're not taking advantage of all the different skills, talents, and that, are already present. So we're not using the assets that we have, which are our people, to their highest function, because we continuously, either intentionally or unintentionally, continue to block people out of certain spaces.
Thank you. I'm going to go into our Q&A. Maybe Jeff, you can help answer our question. One of our questions from Frederick Kendricks is, how can career changers quickly position themselves to enter cannabis or solar tech given the current climate?
Yeah, so it's going to depend a little bit on the space. But I think I mentioned it a little earlier that, all of these spaces are broader than just the technology. Each space has its own legal component, has its own sales component, marketing, et cetera, customer success, whatever, you name it. And so I think it's about, one, understanding what stage of company are you really looking at. So a company that's early stage is going to be assessing candidates very differently than someone, the Googles of the world care about something very different than a company at my stage. And so a lot of it is around how do you frame prior experience to kind of fit within the narrative that they're looking for. I think on the more negative end of the spectrum is, frankly, a lot of these industries are super network dependent. And so getting access to a lot of these jobs comes down to, do you know the right person who's at the, making the right decisions? And frankly, we've been frozen out of a lot of those networks. And so that one is a trickier one to overcome. I think you are seeing a lot of organizations go out of their way to try to expand beyond kind of that network thinking and look for candidates at HBCUs, look for candidates that are women, whatever it may be. And so I think it's getting better, and I think it will get better. But at best, you can, I think, frame yourself in the right way so that you're speaking the same language they're speaking, and that any resume can be crafted to just kind of be viewed through the lens that they're trying to look at things.
Thank you. We have another question from Gail Hampton. Anyone, feel free to jump in. The question is, what is the minimum amount of capital needed to start a solar, tech, health, and cannabis small business?
So I think it depends. So I guess I tend to differentiate like a small business from like a high growth startup. I kind of think of them a little differently. So there are the businesses where you are going to self-sustain off of your revenue, and that's kind of how you grow and bootstrap over time. I think those require probably a smaller level of startup capital to get going. So you may be talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars at that scale. Whereas if you're trying to start a business that you want this to be a high growth startup, I mean, you're talking about millions, typically millions of dollars to get those going. And probably even, I mean, the cannabis industry is, even worse. I'm sure Manny can speak to that. I mean, those are businesses where you're trying to raise, you need like $20 million just to even bid on a license, right? Like, so those are even more outrageous.
And I'll throw this comment out there. As you're thinking about positioning a business in an industry, think about not just the dollar cost when you say how much does it cost, but think about ways that you can leverage what you bring in to reduce that dollar cost. For example, when we were looking at getting into the solar industry, simple SWOT analysis said that in many places in the BIPOC community, the technical expertise was not there that you needed, and the financial capital was not there that you needed. And so right away, you could come to the conclusion that that means you can't get in. And my background years ago was I was in marketing management with the old Bell system when it was all AT&T and Mobile. So I know a fair amount about marketing. So I know that these companies that have typically young, white, very highly educated people with lots of money in the solar field, that's what's there. But all companies want greater market penetration. And that means they want to get in and have their businesses do well in BIPOC communities, but they don't have those relationships. So we said, rather than start with a solar construction company, which costs more to do, let's start with a solar marketing company, because we can show them that many times that we can put marketing programs together better than they have to get customers. And we said to them, we'll do that part for you if you partner with us on the other end, the finance and the technical end. That got us in the business. And we started a few years ago, and now we have our own solar construction company there because of that. So you assess what you have that can make the cost less for you to get into it.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. It's been great. I just really want to thank you for your responses, for a great discussion, for sharing your thoughts and bringing your background expertise to the issue of advancing equity in emerging industries. Thank you.